Hello and welcome back to the Ash and Stone channel. My name is Chris, and in this video I'll show you how I've gone about making these flexible coast and water foam tiles. I'll be using these 600 by 600mm interlocking foam tiles I picked up from the hardware store. I want the coast to be more of a transition between the water and land tiles than full standalone pieces, so I'm going to cut one of the tiles in half to get two coast tiles. When you're cutting EVA foam, make sure that your knife is sharp. A blunt knife will tear the foam rather than cutting it, and you'll end up with a torn mess along the edges. I make a number of light cuts with a straight edge as a guide until I'm through. So these pieces are going to be the base that the water will sit on, and we'll add another layer of foam to raise up the shore level above it. The shore pieces are cut from another tile with a wandering edge that I want to make sure match up with each other so the tiles will sit side by side nicely. Once they're cut out, I bevel the edges of the shore with the knife to give us a nice sloping transition between the water and the land. I avoid taking too much off around the teeth of the foam tile, as they'll end up being quite fine and I don't want to risk damaging them until everything is stuck down. Once that's roughed out, we can glue the pieces of foam together. I use a water-based contact adhesive. The top side of the base piece is given a coat of glue in the appropriate areas, and the bottom side of the shore piece is likewise given a coat. That is set aside to dry, and when it does, they can be stuck together. I use a couple of the little edge pieces to help me align the teeth of the mats, and press the shore piece down onto the base. You have to be careful with contact glues because once they touch, that's it, they're stuck, and there's not a lot you can do about it if it's not right. You get the one chance. Once it's on, I firmly press the shore piece onto the base to ensure that it's securely anchored. Now that they're stuck together, I join the two mats and carefully cut the foam to make sure the transition between tiles is spot on. I also take this opportunity to further refine the transition between the shore and the base. I find a bit of sandpaper is great for knocking off some of the high points left by the knife to smooth things out. You can absolutely use power tools for this, I just didn't want to deal with the mess. Once happy, I brush PVA glue over the join between the two pieces of foam to ensure that they are stuck together and that they won't accidentally get torn apart. Probably entirely overkill, but it makes me feel better. I've still got a bit of an abrupt transition between the shore and the base along the coast, so I use hot glue to bridge the gaps as it can be carefully smoothed with a finger, dipping said finger in water every so often because it's a little burny for my delicate little hands. A base of paint is next. I put down a warm grey as a base for the shore area and a beige for the soil on the land, so it's going to match all my other grass tiles. I roughly blend the edges between the two paints together in a very random way, but it'll be covered by grass and other basing materials, so there's no need for things to be perfect. Speaking of which, once the paint has dried, I use Geek Gaming's fast drying basing glue along the shore to glue down the sand for the beach. The basing glue is much better than PVA for this, as it remains more flexible when dry, and even more importantly, it doesn't shrink as much when it dries, so you get a lot less warping of the soft foam base. Near the edges of the tile, I sprinkle on a light layer of sand, just enough to cover the paint, as the edges will see the most wear, so they need to be the most flexible in order to avoid any damage. The sand I'm using is a mix of a couple of sands I've gathered from around the country to give me a stony shore. As I move away from the edges, I put down a heavier coat as it doesn't need to be as flexible in the centre, and a heavier coat helps further smooth out any inconsistencies in the foam beneath. Giving the tile a tap once I've put all the sand down helps to smooth things out, and any thin areas can be topped up before we move on to the next step. At the high tide mark, I sprinkle on a layer of tea, just taken out of a number of tea bags to represent the various debris washed up along the shore. Then I sprinkle on a small amount of beige grout to ease the transition between what would be the soil and the sand of the beach. Finally, a layer of driftwood is added at the top of the high tide mark. This is literally driftwood I gathered from a local beach. I chucked in the oven for about an hour to kill off any nasties, then crushed it with hand and hammer and blended it to break it down into a more appropriate size. Once that's all where I want it, I take the tiles outside and give them a spray with isopropyl alcohol and then a mix of watered down PVA with a little dish soap. The isopropyl alcohol has a really low surface tension, which means that it soaks into the sand and other basing materials rather than sitting on the top. Watered down PVA doesn't soak in very well by itself. Adding the dish soap lowers its surface tension, which helps it to penetrate deeper, and pre-soaking with isopropyl enhances this effect, ensuring the glue is carried deep into the sand where it can surround each grain, rather than sitting on the top like a shell with loose sand underneath. Any excess is mopped up with a paper towel, and the tiles are put aside to dry. So very helpful there, aren't you? Hey? That's your hair, you tart. Hey? That's your hair. Cat hair everywhere. It's the next day and everything is dry, so it's time to put on some grass. Once again, I use fast drying basing glue, being careful to avoid getting any down the sides of the teeth, as that will cause the tiles to stick together later. I work in sections, applying 2mm spring static grass with my static grass applicator, and using a newspaper shield to stop too much of the grass ending up in the sand. When the 2mm is down, I flip the board and knock off the excess. Then, not waiting for the glue to dry, I apply a bunch of glue blobs across the grassy areas and apply 4mm spring grass to build up depth and variation in the grass. I avoid putting any on the teeth along the edge, and by leaving this area pure 2mm grass, it'll match up with any other tile that I have grass on. The excess is knocked off and I let the glue dry for a half hour or so. I can then stick on the tufts that I made in the last video and sprinkle on some areas of Woodland Scenic's fine turf and knock leaves to add further variations of colour and texture to simulate weeds and other plants. Once again, the tiles are taken outside and given a soak of IPA and watered down PVA. I find it a good idea to let the static grass glue dry a bit before giving it a soak, as otherwise it tends to mix with the watered down PVA and it just gets a little messy. I just tend to get better results if I leave it for 30 minutes or so. Alright, once that's dry, we can work on the parts you've all been waiting for, the water. Because we're working on a foam tile that is lightweight and flexible, we want the same properties for our water effect, so we're going to make the crappiest fiberglass in the world. Toilet paper and water-based contact adhesive is our solution. Working in small sections, I put down a layer of straight water-based contact adhesive on the areas that are going to be water. Once an area is glued, I fold over the top edge of a strip of toilet paper and press it down into the glue. It's not shown above, but I found pressing it down with a roller and flattening it out to be the best way of doing it. I work my way along until I have a single layer along the shore. When you put the paper down, you have to put it all down in one direction. Funnily enough, toilet paper has a grain and it will wrinkle in one direction when wet. We want those wrinkles to all be in the same direction and facing the right way. Once the first layer is down, I mix up a water and glue mix using the contact adhesive at about 50-50-ish and carefully apply it over the toilet paper layer. You just want to sort of pat the watery glue down rather than brushing it, as the paper will easily tear. It's generally better to work in small sections, but after applying the watery glue, I then place another layer of paper on top. I stagger the paper so that the new layer covers the join in the previous layer. And I do this twice, so that I end up with 3 layers of toilet paper in total. I give it a roll to flatten things out and work any air out. Then, using the watery glue mix and the brush, you pat and prod and work the toilet paper into the shapes you want. it turns into a mush as you work it, and you want to try and work out any bubbles, joins and embossed patterns. If you can get paper that has no embossing, it's much better. You also take this time to work in any waves. You can add extra paper to areas that need it, for higher waves or to fill gaps for example, and I make sure that there is plenty of glue around the edges of the foam teeth. Mostly it's a bunch of faffing about, going backwards and forwards and just working with the paper until you're happy with it. I came across this technique thanks to Marklin of Sweden's channel. He used PVA, which is fantastic for his train layout, but unfortunately PVA isn't as good for the foam tiles as it shrinks too much and you end up with massive warping. The water-based contact adhesive I'm using shrinks far less, and it doesn't remain sticky like the fast drying basing glue does. While we wait for that to dry, and it does take a while thanks to all of that water, I want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Patreon. Thank you very much for your continued support, it means the absolute world to me. Later on, I paint on a bead of PVA glue on the underside around all of the teeth to reinforce the glue around the edges. And once that's dry, then comes the fiddly task of trimming the paper. I use scissors and a sharp knife to trim the paper to match the teeth of the foam mats. After much practice, I've found this easiest done with a fine, sharp knife like a number 11 scalpel. This would be much easier if they weren't puzzle pieces, but that's where we are. Then, PVA again. The teeth and edges will always be a weak point of these tiles, and so I take the time now to reinforce them. Is it necessary? Don't know, but it sure seems like a good idea to me. So I paint PVA over the edges of the paper and foam teeth to further reinforce and seal that join. Now at last we can get to painting. I start by mixing up a grey and brownish, I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. Let's check out the website. Rosine soya bean is a tofu and sesame green edge brown. Good gods! To get a colour similar to my sand mix, which is painted on areas of the shore where the water is thin, such as where the water is receding. While it's still wet, I blend it with my darker watercolour. I picked 3 shades of grey-blue for my water. The darker shade goes along the shore and shallow spots, while the lighter shade goes into the deeper areas with the mid-tone in between. It seems kind of unintuitive, but because of the grey stone beach, the shallow water is darker than the deeper stuff. Anyway, working fairly quickly, with all 3 paints available, I blend them together while they're still wet, stippling backwards and forwards until I'm happy with how things are looking. I make sure that the edge going out to sea is pure mid-tone, so it will match any other waterboards I do, and stick the shore pieces together to ensure a nice blend between them. Once that's all dry, I use a white to highlight the tops of the waves where they break and where foam gathers, before I go outside and give the water 2 coats of clear gloss spray paint. When that is dry, it's done! Woohoo! I use the same technique to make full boards of water that remain lightweight and flexible and allow me to go from the ocean to the land. When laying out the tiles, any land tile attached to the shore will sit on top of a plain, or in this case stone tile, to raise them up above the water level. Let me know what you think. Thanks very much for watching, and we shall see you next time. Cheers!